This is part of my series of formal elements, and today I'm going to look at shape and pattern as well. So to start with then, looking at shape, you can use all sorts of ways to create different shapes when you're creating artwork. So it can be that you cut out shapes, or it can be that you look at an image and break it down into simple shapes to make it easier for you to draw. Shape can also lend itself to pattern, sort of repeat pattern. That was just using a photocopier. This image I've traced the figure and then repeated the figure in a few areas, and I've used watercolours to create this. It's mixed media really, so there's watercolour wet on wet there, some pastels here. I've gone over this in fine liner, but it is literally looking at a series of shapes that make up the image, and I've cut out as well, so it's sort of, you know, textured as well. Shape can lend itself to abstract as well, so it can be that you want to just represent something. This is representing a figure that's sort of hunched over and bending down, touching the floor, but just by looking at different shapes and cutouts. These shapes on this image are based on Ashanti Adinkra symbolism, where I made print blocks out of polystyrene and then used some printing ink and printed each one sort of separately. The idea being they've all got a separate meaning linked to identity. This is on fabric, it's on cotton fabric, and there's a watercolour wash on the background, and then the print has gone on top. Okay, so it's like a relief print. I have developed this image through a collage and took it into a fashion illustration. So the idea with this was to draw the illustrations first, and then I've used watercolour on the background and then some collage. So there's some tissue paper in certain areas that you can see, and then these shapes have been torn out of paper and just placed, so they're very loose, they're very, you know, imagine that without the watercolour background it's slightly short from the edges, but that doesn't really matter, it just makes for an interesting combination really. Yeah, and I've just sort of tore little shapes for certain areas and then made them into the sort of shape that I actually wanted. I did develop that project through looking at some illustrations. I wanted to take that through Photoshop, so I created some illustrations of car headlights that were representing the cars that were made at Austin Rover in Longbridge. And then this has been scanned, so all of these different shapes have been scanned and then taken into Photoshop, and I've got different colourways where I've created some fashion illustrations using that particular image. This was just a repeat pattern, and this was repeated onto through Photoshop and then printed onto fabric. I'm going to continue into pattern really now. Again, this was a print. I didn't like it particularly, so I've just created a figure out of that print and then cut out that shape and then superimposed it onto here. Again, this is just a simple shape where you can create pattern as well around it. Both of these need some work really, they're quite basic at the minute. Ideally I could sort of stitch into these a little bit more, or even paint into them slightly more. Okay. This is a print using liner, I think this was, and so I've turned the image around each time so that it's created a sort of random print and a random pattern. Both of these mini booklets, on this one here, this is mainly fine liner, but it was inspired by lots of little patterns that you can see just around. So some of these patterns were curtains, some are just images that you can see from utensils in the kitchen. Lots of this, I can't remember what that was pots, some pots in the garden, but again you can imagine that as a repeat pattern. An apple print, just really simple lines that sort of bring out the background, so you've got a contrast between the two. Yeah, just squiggly patterns. This is water soluble fine liner, where I've just added a touch of water to differentiate between the background and the foreground, and the same here, really, just a little splash of water. Okay, and then this is just on a larger scale, and on some nice sort of brown textured paper as well, where you get a completely different background with that colour coming through. So it's just a series of patterns that I found from different fabrics mainly. So, you know, you can see that the shape in here, there is mark making, there's lines and dots as texture, so it's sort of a bit of a combination of everything really. Yeah, so predominantly pattern. Some of these patterns are from different cultures, so it's looking at different representations through culture. This creature, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-headed creature, was inspired by a television programme, but rather than taking it down the sinister route, I decided to add some pattern, using, again, mainly fine liner, some watercolour, just to create this effect. Some cross hatching there, and then the last two here are using watercolour and batik paste to create the outlines before the paint was applied. And again, that is a pattern in its own right, but that could be repeated. And then this one, you can see that there is already a repeat pattern running through this. The paste is actually still on there, but I quite like the texture of the paste. That can actually be picked off. If it was something that you were going to wear, you would pick off that paste and then seal the pigment with a hot iron, and then that would be okay to make into a garment, or to stitch onto a garment. Okay, so that's shape and pattern.